Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Since the beginning of 2017, 16 acts of terror were reported across Europe alone by what security officials described as motivated by Islamic extremism. To further discuss the ongoing threat of Islamic terrorism in Europe and around the West, I'm joined here in the studio by Colonel in Reserve, Dr. Reuven Berko, who is a columnist at the Israel Hayom Daily. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Zeev Hanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
Thanks.
Mr. Oren, as I said, since the beginning of 2017, 16 separate acts of terror, during which there were some 47 casualties, 199 wounded. How much of a challenge is this for European security services to deal with this challenge?
It is not only a challenge, and of course a very severe challenge, but also the very reason why U.S. policy vis-a-vis Daesh has changed from what Secretary of Defense James Mattis said, from attrition to annihilation. Up to now, the battles in Iraq and in Syria, centering around Mosul, West Mosul now because East Mosul has been liberated, Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria, have been conducted in such a way as to leave the beleaguered ISIS fighters escape routes, because no one wanted them to fight to the last man and cause many more civilian casualties. But this has changed. Now they are being encircled in order for them to be killed one by one, and therefore the foreign fighters who are staying there in Mosul and Raqqa will not be able to go back home and perform such acts. What the American military is saying, that up until a few months ago, 1,500 foreign fighters a month were going back from Iraq and Syria to Europe, sometimes via Turkey. Now it went down to 100 a month, and it is still going down. We are going to see more battles of life and death in order for them not to go back to Europe and perform such terror acts. But in the meantime, they are getting orders, especially from Raqqa, from the capital of the Caliphate, to act in as many places, cause as many casualties as possible.
Dr. Berko?
Well, I see it as a balloon effect. The more the strikes of Russia, the strikes of America and the allies, and even the strikes of Egypt in Libya and other strikes around the area increases, the more the stream of those terrorists will be back home, in which they meet the communities of Muslims that are already prepared as a petri dish for their arrival. Not only that these petri dishes have already supplied these people to the areas of conflict, but they are now ready to absorb them. They're parallel to these actions. We could see how incitement by computers, how incitement by mosques has raised these activists, but we see that the fact that they can no longer act in the arenas of Syria and Iraq caused them naturally to come back, and the more as time goes by, we will see them hurting the very, very exposed nerves of the West. And as far as I can see from now, the West are not well prepared for the challenge, because they do nothing actually. If I compare it to what Israel is doing here, by meaning of intelligence or pre-acts that can even prevent the activities to come. And this, of course, create a lot of questions the West is standing against, whether the liberty and the pluralism or freedom of speech and freedom of the individuals or whatever, and the ability to stop people even before they act. That's something that raises a lot of moral challenges, because even the intelligence in the West can see what is about to happen. Can you arrest people for something that they haven't yet done?
Well, this is very interesting and very worrisome as well, Dr. Hanin. When we're hearing from Mr. Oren the fact that some 1,500 people who were both in Syria and in Iraq operating under the auspices of the Islamic State, returning from those war zones to Europe, including Russia and Western Europe, and even some to the United States. We have now, of course, this number decreasing, but still they have come there. The key challenge, as being stated by various intelligence officials, is that it's not only a battle against those organizations, it's a battle against the ideology behind this Islamic State and behind Al-Qaeda and Islamic extremism in general. Do you believe that those various foreign fighters that were operating in those countries, now that they return, will they now spread the ideology and this same spirit that raged in Syria and Iraq?
Absolutely. First of all, it is true that Syria becomes a sort of a resource center for terrorist infrastructure all over the world, including Europe. And at least in this case, Russia is a part of Europe. If we will take into account that quite substantial number of those fighters that fight on the behalf of the Islamic State and other political and military Islamist organizations in Syria are actually originally from Russia or from Russian Federation or former Soviet Union, or at least Russian Federation passport holders. We understand that Moscow now faces quite a problem concerning the fact that these people are coming back. Not all of them are coming back to Russia, by the way. Some of them are coming back to Central Asia. Some of them infiltrate to Europe. And if we are talking about ideology, a sort of a combination of ideology of political Islamism and some influence of understanding of political culture that they had in Russia, not in Russia in general, but we are talking about these areas of Russia which are much more similar to their areas with the Eastern political culture rather than the Western, like in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on and so forth. We understand that they have a problem. Let's not forget that according to different estimations, something between 20 to 22 million of ethnic Muslims, they're a part of the Russian population. That means that Russia is the biggest Islamic country in Europe. We are talking about Islamic component in Europe and forget that Russia is the biggest one. So, of course, overwhelming majority of these people are not Islamists and even not so good Muslims. Still, it's a sort of a background or basis that radical ideology could spread everywhere, and what people do are coming back from Middle East. They're doing their job.
Mr. Oren.
What Professor Hanin is absolutely right. Russia is supposed to be the second or third source for foreign fighters. The first one is Saudi Arabia. Now, people don't talk about Saudi Arabia because Saudis, if they go to Paris or to Brussels, will stand out. And the law enforcement agencies or security services could pick them up. But they could go back to Saudi Arabia and cause an upheaval there. And there we will see whether the Saudi promises to President Trump during the Trump visit to the kingdom are being implemented. Because up to now, the House of Saud wanted to pay extortion money to various terrorist groups rather than fight them. So this is the forgotten or neglected front against ISIS in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf in general. But on the other front, the difference between what happened up to now in the fight against Al-Qaeda was that Al-Qaeda had a territorial base in Afghanistan, was helped by the Taliban government when the Americans came in. Then they fought in Iraq. They thought that if they get the territorial base for Saddam Hussein conquered, they will get rid of the problem. ISIS wants to show that even when it is losing ground, and it is lost ground, 55,000 kilometers over the last several months. That's more than double the territory of Israel, for instance. And they never recapture anything they lose. even though they do that, they want to show that the idea is not dead, that the spirit is not dead, and that they can be revived. They will withdraw to the desert. They will come back.
On that note, I want to touch base. Of course, there was been the terror attack some couple of weeks ago in Egypt, where we had some 29 Christians murdered by Islamic State terrorists who have, of course, the organization claimed responsibility for the attack. This is not just the last attack. There's a series of attacks when we're talking also about Manchester and other areas. But does the Islamic State somehow seek to bolster its image among the young people, among people who still hold some kind of connection to this ideology through the perpetration of those heinous acts?
No doubt, it's part of the operational code of radical Islamism is to tempt people to join and to frighten people that we are very dangerous and we can do this and that, mainly against Christians as infidels and others. This is the operational code of radical Islamism, and more than that, we are misled to think that sometimes the basis, like Afghanistan and other places like Raqqa, like Mosul, is critical. It's critical because the creating the little Islamic State is something that is built inherent in the operational code of radical Islamism, is a base to get out and attack other places. It's critical, but the ideology is everywhere. So in this matter, you can go and create an Islamic State hidden from intelligence eyes everywhere, in Chechnya or in America or wherever. This is one point. The other point is that till now we are still blind-eyed to understand that it's not only to fight the mosquitoes, but the principle is to dry the swamp. Where the swamp? Imagine that President Trump has visited Saudi Arabia and saw people represented by Qatar, which is one of the states famous by funding terrorists, and nobody dared to say directly, listen carefully, it's right, our base is in Qatar, but you're funding terror, including the story of Turkey that is double agent. On the one hand, they fund terrorism on the basis of Sunnah, radical Islamists of the Sunnah, and the other day they pretend to prevent immigrants to go and get bribe. They get money for preventing this. Double agents, by all means. So the story of those who supply the water to the swamp, and by this, water I mean money, by this allow the Islamic terrorist activities, the mosquitoes, this permanent fueling, this is the dangerous.
Dr. Hanin, when we're talking about Russia specifically, President Vladimir Putin has on several occasions urged the Americans to cooperate on when it comes to fighting radical Islamists and Islamic terrorism at large, around the world, wherever it's possible. Something that the Americans have, of course, greeted with caution, as they're quite concerned about hidden interests of Russia in general when we're talking about both Syria and other places around the region. How do you see this mutual danger, common danger, actually aligned between not enemies, but strategic enemies, if you will?
Answering your question, but also following
Please.
what Dr. Berko said and Amir mentioned before, I would say that Russians at the moment should learn from the United States, or believe to learn from the United States, but not so positive, but rather negative experience of Americans. We do remember that in the time of the Afghan war, United States and some other Western countries were those who endorsed the Islamic terrorists in order to stop their expansion of communism, Russian's power, Soviet Union-sponsored communism, and thought that that's a less danger rather than the communist world. So at the moment they're eating what the Americans, what the Americans eating what they promoted, but at the moment Russians are coming back to the same track. In fact, if we come back to the situation in Chechnya, or Northern Caucasus, or in the Middle East. We have the same story like Americans have in Qatar, it is what mentioned. Russians are present in Syria, and on the other hand, terrorists or militants originally from Russia are also there. in fact fighting the Russian troops that present in Russia. So, in fact, what could be the aim of Moscow, what they should do? On the other hand, they're interested to be present in the Middle East because there is no superpower which is not present in the Middle East since the end of 18th century. Yes, sir.
One thing to mention:
Please.
if you strengthen the other kind of terrorism, which is the Iranian terrorism, you do nothing.
Yes,
This is
that's
the same.
exactly the point.
So the Russians are now fighting for the sake of Iran and Bashar al-Assad. This is the other side of the same coin.
I was in the International Conference of Security in Moscow a few weeks ago. So when actually this idea was mentioned there, and most part of the Israeli military and political establishment was very much against this notion. However, that doesn't mean they are not right. But on the other hand, just to finish my last point,
Yes.
I would say that at the moment Russians have a dilemma. It was a good idea to get rid of the local terrorists by sending them to Caucasus, or even better, to Syria. But now we are coming back to the same question: what happens when they're
well
coming
trained
back?
now.
Yeah,
well
absolutely.
trained.
What happens when they come back to the Caucasus or Bulgaria?
Mr. Oren, is Europe, is the West, is Russia ready for those people who are coming back?
The problem is that Europe and Russia have other items on the agenda, and there is no global coalition. And we saw what happened the other week when President Trump was both in Brussels and in Taormina, Sicily, trying to find some points of agreement with the Europeans and NATO countries, and couldn't because they have divergent views on many other points. However, there is some ray of light here, because during the election campaign, some voters found candidate Trump appealing because of his business background. They expected him to act in office once elected as a very shrewd businessman. It is perhaps true that in the ISIS fight, he is trying to emulate his business success. What has happened is that, first of all, he has appointed the Department of Defense rather than the Department of State as the lead agency in the fight. The other thing is that he only ordered them to enhance the pace and the intensity of the campaign. He doesn't deal in details, and he has delegated down to the lowest level possible the conduct of the fight itself, which means that if the commander in Afghanistan wants to bomb with the Moab super bomb, he can. It is not being micromanaged from the White House. And if Secretary Mattis wants the commander on the ground in Mosul or in Raqqa to do it in a certain tactical way, they can, without waiting for approval from President Trump.
Nevertheless, you just mentioned Secretary Mattis, who is a general, former general. We have also General McMaster. Both are very knowledgeable about the situation in the Middle East. They quite know all the ways around the situation, the various militant organizations, and so on. How much of an added value is this for the Trump administration?
There is certainly an added value, especially with Secretary Mattis, because General McMaster is only coordinating via the National Security Council what is happening in the administration. But the front man and the lead man is Secretary Mattis, who has been, among other things, the commanding general of the Central Command, the very area where the fight against ISIS is being conducted, not only in Iraq and in Syria, but also in Yemen, also in Africa, in Chad. There are French coordinating with the Americans. And what Mattis has managed to do, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, is to coordinate with more than 60 partners. There are 60 plus nations, plus the Interpol, plus the Arab League, and plus the European Union, and now perhaps NATO, but this is redundant because all 28 members of NATO are already in the fight. So looking at it from a chief of staff level, Secretary Mattis has been doing an outstanding job.
Dr. Berko, when we're talking about Europe, I'd like to specifically talk about the United Kingdom, where just a few years ago, the United Kingdom has allocated significant amounts of funding for growing its intelligence apparatus, its various military, and strengthen its police as well, law enforcement. However, now that this terror attack occurred in Manchester, it brings into question how actually effective are those organizations in the operational level.
Well, first of all, when we look about money, we do not understand yet that the story is not only money and agencies. The story is a very radical change in what these agencies can or cannot do according to the law. This is one thing, and what Amir has just mentioned, this coordination between even nations, you can see how complicated this coordination is when we reach to the point of sharing intelligence. Look at the story of the President Trump and the information that has been or not been reached by Israel. The matter is not what the source is, but how you behave with the intelligence we've already had. So the story is sharing contradictional interest in the area when a state support Iran and other state support the Sunnis, and they meet in the middle in order to fight Daesh, which is something you cannot bridge over. That this story of sharing and the suspicious standpoint of many countries prevent the joint venture of fighting terrorism. And you can see even in Britain, the Labour leader support Palestinian terror, and he shared one of the rituals of those who had Israeli sportsmen in Munich lately. Mm-hmm. So even those who lead policy or should lead, or maybe, God forbid, lead, I speak about Coburn or what's his name. So imagine that such a man will lead Britain one day.
Dr. Hanin,
would you seriously fight terrorism?
Dr. Hanin, when we're talking about the readiness, the preparedness of the various organizations, the groups, something that Dr. Berko has pointed is the judicial system that needs to back those organizations in operating. Do you believe that Europe and Russia and the United States, for that specific point, are they willing, or do they have the public backing in order to make these drastic changes?
I would say that the story is even more complicated that you and colleagues say. It's not just a confusion or conflict of interest between various states that have various allies, so there's also a conflict between different groups of interest within the states. We once said that...
Like in England.
Like in England or Russia or the Soviet Union. We had a wonderful joke in the Soviet Union that despite of the fact that our political or their political system is one party, it's one party, many entrance system. That means, and the same could be said about Great Britain, with all respect to the state, with the United States, with all the respect, and some other states, meaning that like in Russia, you have on one hand the so-called nuclear lobby, which is very much in favor of strengthening cooperation with Iran and doing whatever that Iran wants. On the other hand, you have people in the defense ministry or the defense or security bodies that very much in favor of cooperation with Israel and the United States in this field. So first, before thinking about how we work, how all of them do on the platform of international organizations, we first have to ask questions, how they do on the national level.
Do they on a national level, however, have significant logistical and legal aspects in place in order to combat this Islamic terrorism?
Well, in principle, they do. They do have it. On the other hand, the situation is changing so quickly that we have to adapt the system, including the legal system, political, diplomatic, military intelligence to the changing situation. And I'm not sure that everywhere, including the Western countries, the system is flexible enough in order to adapt itself to the urgent needs.
Dr. Oren.
It's very difficult to calibrate the holes in the net, in the security net. If the holes are too big, terrorists go through them. If they are too small and you catch innocent people, you make them empathize with terrorists and perhaps help them, perhaps not become terrorists themselves, but help them
Identify with
in their endeavors. Because if you look at the Manchester bombing, one of the criticisms at the British security services and the police was that the perpetrator, Abedi, was only on the big list of the 20,000 names of suspects, but not on the smaller list of 3,000 even more suspected suspects, which only goes to show you the magnitude of the problem. If you have 20,000 suspects, you cannot have 80,000 police officers in a four-man shift and in 3 shifts a day follow them all around. It is impossible. And one must catch them when they go to Libya or come back from Libya. And the fact that he had so many people who assisted him in his neighborhood means that there was some problem with not only intelligence but also operations in the police and security service operations.
I've had the opportunity to speak a few years back with head of the police in Belgium who had some situations where he did say and specifically note that the people who were responsible for the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks were in prison in Belgium at the time, and the judicial system couldn't back them by keeping them in prison, which unfortunately led to the heinous attack. How do you see this situation actually change from that point to today?
But that's another of the dilemmas, because if you keep them in prison too long, they get more radicalized, they get friendly with other terrorists, and when they go out, because eventually they will go out, they will perhaps become even more hardened terrorists. So it's a very, very difficult mission to find the right people to focus on. And there is a difference in the mentality between police officers and security service personnel. Police officers, as well as judges, wait until the crime has been committed, and then they go to catch the perpetrator. And here, the mission is to preempt, to prevent, and therefore you get...
And to predict.
And then, therefore, you get special permission to use those means which usually a democratic society refrains from using.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'll give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing sentence. Dr. Berko?
I would join what you said by saying that the widest frame of understanding the challenge is to define it. And I mean, to understand that there is no politic Islam. There is an ideology made by the Dawah, widespread by the Dawah. The Dawah is not innocent. The Dawah is trying to convince people that the slaughterings and killing at the days of the Prophet are to be imitated today. This is the idea to be changed.
Dr. Hanin?
The bad news is that we are talking about the fact that quite relatively small group of Islamists that infiltrated in Europe impose their norms and standards on other Muslims and the rest of the society. Everybody say that will not happen. The problem is that's already happened, because the fact we have to take care damaging their
This is the Dawah.
Right.
This is the Dawah.
This is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Berko, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Hanin for coming here today, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.